Hi, I'm with Jaime Seltzer, scientific director for ME Action. And hi, Jamie. I wanted just to talk to you about it's been 5 years more or less, give or take how one counts the start of the pandemic, not since long COVID, but since the coronavirus pandemic, and now we've had long COVID. And so I just wanted to sort of see if you have any kind of overall reflections about what we've learned in these 5 years or what this has meant for ME specifically, because we were both involved in that sort of field before. So how do you sort of, what's your big view of this at this point?
My big view is that overall, the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and long COVID increased awareness of infection-associated chronic illnesses. Obviously, we would have preferred awareness to grow in literally any other way. Um,
Right?
yes. But because so many people got COVID around the same time, we had an enormous increase of people with MECFS and other pre-existing infection-associated chronic illnesses. And, which is to say that these diseases are often triggered by infection, but they can be triggered by any strong immunological shift.
Hmm.
Regardless, a huge pandemic like this is going to make a lot more people aware of IACCs, either because they or someone they know contracted long COVID, or because they're just hearing about it more. In addition, the NIH having so much more research on IACCs made researchers and clinicians more aware of it, in my estimation.
Did you think that clinicians, I mean, we knew beforehand, of course, that, or people knew, was known that viral infections in particular, but other infections as well, can lead to, prolonged symptoms in some group of people. But did you think that but the world seemed to be surprised by that when COVID happened, and doctors did
Yes.
as well.
Yes, they did seem surprised. There's not really any excuse for it at this point. I think that even within the world of MECFS experts, I think that there are still people who question that multiple different environmental and immunological triggers can initiate cases of MECFS or take cases that are very mild with very low symptoms that people were living with more or less okay and make them into moderate and severe presenting cases. I think there's still chat back and forth about, one true cause theories. So I think even within our own community, there are still questions about that. And in my mind as well, given the evidence I have, I would say that there are multiple different possible triggers, but I'm fully aware that we don't have enough evidence to say that that is 100% certain. We haven't analyzed it to the extent that science would be comfortable with being certain. So I think that from people who are outside of the world of research and clinical care and patient advocacy in these spaces, yeah, they didn't know. They ought to have, but should happen and does happen are not the same thing.
And so, and as you know, there was also a lot of concern expressed early on, and to some degree still, I think that it's not fair, or else, long COVID, that's getting more attention. And we've had, ME or chronic fatigue syndrome, or whatever one is calling this collection of conditions for all these years, and now they're getting all the attention. There was some sort of sense of unfair, not unfair competition, but sort of recognized kind of unfairness of the fact that people have been sick for a long time with these things, but now it's only getting attention more because of these other things. And will the attention to this other thing, i.e., long COVID, swamp concern or any attention about ME? So how do you see those factors having played out, or being resolved or not resolved?
Attention is a double-edged sword. So there was a flood of information about long COVID, people talking about long COVID, obviously at ME Action, and I think every ME advocate was doing their best to conceptualize ME in the context of here's this new pathogen,
Mhm.
and yet it's giving rise to a series of symptoms that a lot of other post-pathogenic syndromes have done. So, and I think people in the long COVID community were doing that as well. Not
Mhm.
everybody, but the people that we allied with early on in the pandemic were doing their best to keep diseases like MECFS at the forefront of their conversations. Patient-led research collaborative, long COVID families, and a bunch of other long COVID organizations have collaborated with us over the years, and we appreciate that they told us repeatedly that the existence of organizations like ours and narratives like ours and resources like the ones that we created um, had let them know what was happening to them.
How were
And
those
so,
alliances, how are those alliances forged? That's interesting.
mm,
They were, was it just a natural kind of thing, or did organizations and advocates reach out to some of the early people who were talking about long COVID symptoms, or did the long COVID advocates, was there a crossover from the beginning? How did that kind of
mm.
connection kind of emerge?
There was crossover from the beginning, and there was crossover at multiple levels. Anticipating the fact that a lot of people were going to develop MECFS or something like it after COVID, I created the pacing and management guides. Those are now recommended by dozens of other advocacy organizations, but also public health organizations at the
I'm
state,
sorry,
national level.
which guides were those? Say that again.
The pacing and management guide.
Okay.
Um, and though for a lot of people, that was how they found out what was happening to them. Um, I was feverishly on social media. Every time somebody was saying, I don't understand, I went to do my usual workout and it's tomorrow and I can't breathe. I would pass them the pacing guide, which explains post-exertional malaise, explains MECFS.
Hmm.
And then we developed a pediatric guide in conjunction with long COVID families that talked about MECFS and long COVID in the context of PEM and pacing. And then we developed a guide for clinicians with patient-led research collaborative. So in one way, it was these organizations were finding us. Um, Body Politic, which was one of the first organizations to talk to ME Action, existed before the pandemic, and they sort of transformed overnight into a long COVID organization because so many of them had gotten sick and had long-term sequelae.
And
So
that's what
they had,
that became, that led to patient-led research
yes,
collaboration.
yes, correct. And so, Body Politic, since they were already an organization, they already had the infrastructure to engage in communications, and they knew, as an advocacy organization themselves, that you don't reinvent the wheel, you look for who is already doing the work. And so we had a lot of early collaborations with them. Even in summer of 2020, we were having webinars together and that kind of thing. But then it's also that boots on the ground stuff where you're on social media and you're sending people resources. You are just engaging in conversation so that people know that these resources exist. And it was very intensive work. But I don't think I've ever done anything more important in my life. And so as a result, I feel like a lot of these organizations are going to remember people with MECFS. Now, I started this all off by saying attention is a double-edged sword, right?
Right.
Because now long COVID has become a political talking point, and an entire party in the United States wants to say that COVID wasn't a big deal. And these patients are being told at their doctor's offices that long COVID isn't a thing. And they are now saying, well, I have MECFS because they meet the diagnostic criteria and they know that there isn't a political association with MECFS the way that there is with long COVID.
Well, so you're hearing some people who now prefer having an MECFS diagnosis as opposed to a long COVID diagnosis because there seems to be at this point, given changes, more possible acceptance of that on a structural level of this
Yeah,
on the
depending on where they live in the country, their doctor is going to have a very different reaction and be more or less inclined to support them with appropriate medical interventions if they say MECFS versus long COVID. That's obviously not everywhere.
right.
Um,
So let's go back though to before the new administration took over.
sure.
And before I mean, now we have some
Well, that was before, by the way. That was happening
unprecedented.
before.
That was happening before,
Yes.
because the Biden administration was trying to play down that COVID was over, that kind of thing, or because
Well, that kind of thing, but also because there was still a political divide in terms of admitting that COVID was a
I see,
serious
I see,
event
I see, I see.
before the current administration was
I
in power.
Okay, so basically, the forces that the current administration came to power, which are now more dominant, were the ones you're talking about, were the sort of the undercurrent resistance on that side that was happening to the idea that COVID was a big thing in the first place. Um,
Yeah.
but okay, so having understood that, now going back to before this administration, before the scientific project is seemingly being destroyed, it's hard to tell what that means for everything, not just for our field.
Oh, I'm happy to talk about that if we get there,
Well,
but
so in terms of the science, where did you see things happening in this kind of long COVID MECFS space, and where, what was the trajectory as far as you could see? And then we can talk
mm,
about where it seems to be at this point.
that's a really good question because at the end of last year, a lot of really positive things were happening. We had the Recover TLC meeting, which was really an incredible analysis of research. I thought that
Explain what that is.
yes, yes, yes. So let's talk very just quickly about Recover to refresh everybody's memory. That was a gigantic $1 billion study series of studies from NIH on long COVID. There was some public dismay about those studies because they were primarily observational, which means just collecting data and looking, not trying medications, for example. But then Recover TLC was developed in response, and it was talking about coming up with useful interventions for long COVID and ways of measuring whether they were successful or not. Um, for those who might not have experience in this, this will seem obvious in retrospect, right? But if there is no singular biomarker that you can measure to tell if a disease is getting better or worse, you have to come up with on-paper instruments or some other way of determining whether a drug was actually effective or not. You can't just ask the patient, do you feel better, right? There has to be some standardized way. And those endpoints, which is what we call them, are usually developed in conjunction with the FDA. And so that meeting had people from FDA, had people from pharmaceutical companies, had advocates like me, had researchers from the NIH and elsewhere. And it was a wonderful meeting. I was really impressed by the quality of the material being delivered. And I was incredibly impressed with Marazzo. That was the first time I had heard her speak. She was the head of NIAID. Um, and
I
she
had
did,
National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
yes.
And when was this meeting?
This was at the end of last year. So I want to say October or November of 2024. Um, and I was there because I was invited to be a panelist and was honored to do it. Um, and I thought that we were really on the right track. I had been speaking to FDA for a little while, off and on, along with some long COVID advocates about developing better endpoints for MECFS and long COVID. And there were rumblings that we were going to develop a working group to do so. So that's where we left off at the end of last year.
And I assume none of that's going forward at this point, or what's the status of any of that?
Por supuesto, no. That means of course not in Spanish. So we lost Marazzo from NIAID. She was effectively banished to Siberia. She was offered a new role in one of the least funded departments within HHS after being told to leave one of the best funded departments at HHS. Allergy and infectious disease is very high funded because it is the seat of AIDS HIV research, along with infectious disease and pandemic prevention. A lot of really important concepts are covered there, and so they tend to get a great deal of funding. Now, since the new administration was instituted, began their work. Um, she was removed as head. There is currently a proposal to take NIAID and split it into three different offices. I assume in part to reduce the amount of power they have. Um, there's a reduction in force.
Fauci's power base. I mean, he ran it for many years, so I
Correct.
think they see him as probably a perhaps as a stronghold of Fauci support. So they don't like Fauci, so
Yes.
yeah,
So there is generally a sort of revenge campaign against um, CDC, NIH, NSF, but with particular focus and interest on aspects of public health and research that were involved in pandemic response in some way.
right,
So Fauci's wife, for example, was one of the people removed from NIAID as well.
right.
Um, and Yeah, the COVID and long COVID materials are being removed from government websites. The new COVID.gov leads to something that looks like the advertisement for a new reality show as opposed to actually containing public health information.
Right.
And it did once have multiple resources about long COVID, some of the best out there. And those are not destroyed, they're elsewhere. But that was a big place people went to go find information, and it's gone. Um,
So
and
what?
of course, we can't ignore the fact that most of these research organizations' budgets have been cut by as much as half.
Right. And I definitely see that as a factor. So okay, what do you see? I mean, now it's May, and so you've got, various lobbying going on and other awareness days and so on. So, what are your, when you can end on this, what are your sort of prospects or hopes for this, and what do you hope going forward, given the current constraints in everything?
Hmm. It's a very good question. I think that we've made the mistake by staying a little too narrow in our focus. I think that I don't see a future for research of any kind in this country unless funding is restored to these organizations in full and there is a hiring spree. Um,
These organizations being NIH,
NIH,
the
CDC,
funding,
NSF,
NSF, and so on. Yeah.
yes. And um, I think that the scope of the problem cannot be overstated.
Mhm.
I would say that it is even beyond my current ability to fully conceptualize what stopping research to this degree is going to look like. But I can say with confidence that even the damage that we've done up to now is going to be years in the repairing, even if we started today. And that
I
if
mean,
it
general
continues over
comments,
the,
these are general comments, not really just
yes,
specifically about ME or long
the
COVID.
whole research endeavor.
Right.
And of course, that includes ME and long COVID. And that is what I mean when I say we can't be like, what's going to happen to ME research? The question is, what's going to happen to research in the United States and around the world? And we need to be fighting with our Congress people. We need to keep those phones ringing. We need to let them know that science in America is what fuels the economy. It's what fuels a better life for our children, better food, safer air, cleaner water. It is all of our livelihoods that are being taken away, and it's research that we have paid for that is being stopped. And I must emphasize too, two things. It's not saving Americans money. In the first 100 days, the administration has spent far more than the same time period last year, to the tune of, I believe, 220 million.
I think there was a figure out there like that. Yeah.
There was a figure out there like that. And then, second of all, in terms of funding, it's not these big overbloated organizations that are getting cut. Everyone likes to think that the administration is cleaning house, but you can actually plot these institutions in terms of their perceived right or left-leaning status and determine the cuts that way. Cuts are directly proportional to perceptions of liberalism in
Mm.
that organization and not in proportion to the size of the organization or anything like that.
Well, you could
So
also
these
probably
are
you could also probably
ideological.
You can also probably just do it as the percentage of people within the organization who have publicly said something negative about Donald Trump, and that would be as good a barometer as any for which ones are likely to have been cut, I would say, perhaps.
Given liberal people who have liberal beliefs are more likely to have said that, that would probably be true. Yes.
Um,
Um,
all right. Well, on that note, so I guess the one question is in your May event. So is that is that a sort of broader emphasis that you're taking with some of your lobbying and with some of your work going forward to make that point that you're embedding the ME and long COVID into this larger narrative of like we're destroying all research, period.
yeah, absolutely. We are saying save the NIH, save our society, save our science. Those are our slogans this year. SOS. And
Okay.
in addition, we're saying please fund the MECFS research roadmap that so many of our researchers and advocates worked hard to develop,
Mhm.
which has a list of priorities on it, and which we obviously need an intact NIH if we expect it to be funded.
Why don't you actually just mention briefly the roadmap?
So the MECFS research roadmap was produced by, well, in conjunction with a number of advocacy organizations, NIAID, NINDS, and there's a gigantic summary of the findings. It's the size of like several research papers, I would say. And it goes through what we think needs to be funded and why. And the Emmy Action executive director, Lori Jones, was on those committees and helped. I helped revise the final product, but that was mostly her work.
Okay. Okay. Well, listen, thanks, Jamie. I really appreciate it. Good to talk to you. And I'm going to end the recording right now.